Hello and welcome to another edition of Kansas City Experience. I'm Amanda Kranos. KCX is a monthly program that pulls together a selection of segments featured on KCPT, Flatland, and 90.9 The Bridge. From our 90.9 The Bridge sessions, local artist Danielle Nicole performs Hot Spell. She will be in town for a sold-out show at Knuckleheads on Thanksgiving Eve.
Baby skin and bedroom eyes, devil in disguise.
We answer a curious KC question and find out the history behind M&M Bakery.
Someone came in to try to hold up the store. She says that Hitler couldn't kill me, and you sure as hell won't. You know, just like that. And she said she stuck a donut in his mouth, and he took off running outside the store.
Kansas City illustrator Pop-Up Charlie shares some of his artistic musings from his travels around the country. In December, the Kansas City Symphony kicks off the Isaac Stern Centenary with a special one-night-only performance of an all-Beethoven concert by Yo-Yo Ma, Pamela Frank, and Emanuel Axe. Last year, KCPT had the privilege of featuring Yo-Yo Ma as part of our Mr. Rogers Kindness Crawl. We share his performance. But first, Thanksgiving is right around the corner, and in Kansas City, the tradition includes more than just turkey. It means kicking off the holiday season on the plaza. This year, Heidi Gardner gets the honor of flipping the switch at the 90th annual Plaza Lighting Ceremony. We get things started by taking a look at how the local actress and SNL star spent some of her time during a recent visit.
Hi, Bailey.
Okay.
Bailey, are you going to look at me?
Okay.
I'm friends with Mary Alice and know her dad, and I heard she was a teacher of a second grade class, and I was like, can I please come meet them? And then she hooked us up with some of the middle schoolers. We got to talk to them, so.
Answering questions and meeting kids.
Yeah.
Have you ever had a time where you was trying to do your own thing and then somebody had like let you down or like got in your way, like a wall?
When I was your guys' age and even older, I would have tried to be more outgoing and love myself more and accept myself for who I was rather than trying to please other people. I just want to let kids know that if they're interested in anything that I do or Zeb does, just give them a path to get there, because we didn't necessarily have that, but just to know that their dreams are absolutely possible.
You don't need perfect equipment. Just start making stuff with your phones and your friends.
Because I can tell you're a good actor already, but you can go and you can learn how to be a better actor, a funnier actor, a more dramatic actor.
Can you talk in that voice and do that one part where you say, I'm not crazy, I'm not crazy?
Okay, well, I have to, let me get into it. So she's like, no, I'm not mad. Go! Okay, I'm not crazy. Stop, I'm not crazy. I hate when you call me that. Do not call me that, okay? I am not crazy. Go, I'm fine. Thank you, I'm fine. I'm not mad. Like that?
Baby skin and bedroom eyes, everything you gotta sell. And if fool could tell, in for a hot spell. Looks like you've been getting ready, setting the mood that I like. I'll be working that teddy. I think I'm in trouble tonight. You gonna do me? Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. The way that you look got me shook tonight. I'm buying everything you got to sell. Damn fool could tell that we're in for a hot spell. I see by the bath that you took tonight with water from deep in your well. And if fool could tell that we're in for a hot spell. I know that you've been getting ready, setting the mood that I like. It's hard for me standing steady. I think I'm in trouble tonight. You gonna do me? Na 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 na. Na 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 na. Na 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 na. La 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 la.
This is an old establishment. And look at here, it's 3:20 in the afternoon, and I have a store full of people in here. Where are you gonna find that at? We bought the business. My wife was a previous employee of M&M. She used to work for Brunya. We bought the business from Brunya. When I first met Brunya, through my wife, I dropped her off to work, and she came in and gave me lunch, or fixed me lunch. And when Brunya first met me, she looked at me and she says, Patrick, that's your name? I said, yes, ma'am. She says, let me see your hands. And she looked at my hands and she says, you have hands of gold. And I didn't understand that then as well as I do now. What that meant was I'm a hard worker. Someone came in to try to hold up the store, and instead of her getting held up, she stuck a donut. She says that Hitler couldn't kill me, and you sure as hell won't. You know, it's like that. And she said she stuck a donut in his mouth, and he took off running outside the store, you know. She said she was a Holocaust survivor. Nothing scared her anymore. She was the type of person that everybody remembered, from little kids to adults. They said Brunya she had a heart of gold. She didn't forget a face. She didn't forget a name. She didn't forget their parents. That's crucial in a business like that. Within the course of the years that we've been here, business has changed. It's for the better. I revamped a lot of the recipes that she had to make them a little bit better for, you know, different diets and stuff like that. The older recipes is our bread. Our cookies is our older recipe. The bread, like I said, we still make the challah, which is the egg bread. And they come in for our breakfast sandwich. They come in for our hook 'em up sandwich. They come in for our Reuben sandwich. They come in for our apple fritters, our glazed donuts, our Long John. You name it, they come in for it. They come in. This is what I want it to be as long as I own it. It's going to always, even if I decide at any given time that I want to pass it down to one of my kids, they're going to run this place as if I'm still here. If I'm getting too old to do this stuff anymore, I promise you this, I'll come here and greet the customers like I've always have.
So we started Cultivate, back then it was called the Kansas City Center for Urban Agriculture, in 2005. We started the organization because we saw this tremendous potential for urban agriculture and for growing our urban food system. As we've gotten to understand our food system better, we understand that it's not just what's within our city boundaries. It's it's the farmers who come into town supply and offer CSAs and the rest. So with climate change in effect and looking at our region's response to climate change, we have been increasingly kind of focusing on those connections. What I can say is that it has been a slow progression of change. an accumulation of extreme weather situations, extreme rains, extreme droughts. What I noticed is that every year, for probably 4 years in a row, I found myself saying, this was a bad year, next year will be better. And at a certain point, it's like, okay, this is the reality. We are going to get rained out in the spring. We're going to, dry out and bake in August. We're going to have winters that are unusually warm. And it's going to affect production, sales, and everything the farmer does. How it feels to work outside, how it feels to be at the farmer's market.
We're at our Westport Commons farm, which is a new farm, farm in process at the old Westport Middle School. We are taking a number of strategies, and we are pretty early on in the process. As an organization that promotes organic practices, we've always emphasized soil building is key to successful production. And so we've always focused on adding soil organic matter, using cover crops, using straw mulches, using practices that increase soil tilth, increase its capacity to retain water, hold it for those times when we aren't getting enough rain. We are also, though, starting to layer in information about use of shade cloth, use of protected structures more and more, not just as a way to extend your growing season, but also a way just to reduce the variability that we're seeing in production when you do it out in the field. So we are focusing on helping farmers develop risk management strategies where if it's too wet out in the field to get in and plant, you're still getting crops from your high tunnel. If you have a greenhouse, what can you produce in the greenhouse that buffers possible losses from from too much rain, too little rain, too much heat? We are active in a new coalition that has started called Metro KC Climate Action Coalition. It is led by mostly municipal, but also state-level elected officials and city staff. And what it is it's bringing together all these incredibly smart leaders to look at what are the policies we can put into place, what can we do using our power to slow down climate, greenhouse gas emissions, what can we do to actively sequester carbon. And so I'm really pleased to be there as a representative of agriculture to be a voice for how you can use food production, farming as a way to reduce greenhouse gases.
Happy Kindness Day, everybody. So here's what happened. Yesterday afternoon, I got an email from my son, which is from Lindsay, who said, we're doing this kindness crawl day, and can you participate? And we looked at it and said, what's not to say yes to? It's unbelievable. And so I'm going to play for you first one of Mr. Rogers' favorite pieces of music. So we can remember his gentleness and kindness by. And then I would like you, I'm going to first ask you, do you know the Tree, Tree, Tree song?
Yes.
Okay. And you know the words, right? It's like, and then the second verse is I love you, right? So we're going to all do that together. But first, I'm going to play you one of his favorite pieces that I actually played for him during his lifetime, but also at his memorial service. So, and we have a lot to celebrate because the legacy is alive. You are alive, you are active, and you are spreading kindness and joy and gentleness all over the city, and you are going to do that all across the country and all around the world. So thank you all for being here.